Anne Hathaway, a quiet force of grace who became slowly, and then all at once, a thunderbolt of talent. She did not arrive as thunder, she arrived as a promise. Born into a house where stories were ordinary things, where a mother once stood on stage and a father kept order with the same gentle hands that made room for imagination. Anne learned to treat performance like breathing. The small hours of rehearsal, the patient repetition of lines, the way a single look could bend an entire scene. These were not curiosities to be tried and forgotten. They were habits to be kept. From an early age, she carried a notebook like scripture and a hunger that looked less like ambition and more like devotion. That devotion would follow her quietly for decades. She was a teenager with stage light in her eyes when the camera first found her. Not yet a star, but unmistakably gifted. She moved through roles that asked little of the world and returned something of herself instead. Tenderness, precision, a sense that the smallest truth would always be enough. Then came a film that asked the world to look with kind eyes, a film that made her a mirror for a generation of awkward girls and nervous dreamers. The Princess Diaries was not the end of a journey. It was a beginning. A door that swung open to reveal an artist who could make comedy feel like confession and vulnerability like armor. There is a temptation when someone rises this way to mistake ease for inevitability. But greatness is never accidental. For Anne, the climb was effort stitched to intuition. She moved from rom-coms and light-hearted charm into parts that demanded more than pretty faces and practiced smiles. She pushed into territory where pain lived, where nuance was harder than applause. She chose roles that required surrender, that demanded she be both visible and anonymous at once, that asked for a voice stripped of protective artifice and offered only rawness in exchange. And so she learned to give herself away to the work. She did not become a dramatic actress by decree. She became one by method, by the steady, almost ascetic work of listening. In Rachel Getting Married, she took a character riven with grief and guilt and found there a kind of meticulous humanity. She stepped into the chaos of a family fractured, and instead of playing the edges, she burrowed into the center. Critics noticed, audiences noticed, but what mattered to her was not the notice. It was the fidelity to the emotion, the faith that if she paid enough attention, truth would follow. Then came the performance that asked for everything. Les Misérables was not a costume and a song. It was an undoing. It demanded that she thin herself down until only voice and feeling remained. She altered her body, her sleep, her appetite, not for spectacle, but because the character required that kind of nakedness. The result was a performance that stopped people in their seats. Awards followed, yes. A golden statue that announced to the world what many already felt in their bones. But for Anne, the trophy was not an arrival. It was a confirmation that the long, patient apprenticeship she had been living would not have been for nothing. Fame, many discover, is a curious thing. It multiplies the quiet, it magnifies the private. Love and marriage and children arrive under the same public light that once followed her to premieres. She met a partner who saw more than the surface, a steady presence who preferred small ceremonies to stage spectacle. Together, they built a private life around the impossible demands of a public one. Parenthood arrived not like fireworks, but like a soft dawn. Babies changed the equation. They taught her the trade-offs between being everywhere and being present. She learned the fragile math of time, that presence is less about abundance and more about priority. She turned her phone face down more often. She chose roles with an eye to the life waiting at home. And in those choices, she revealed something instructive. That reinvention does not mean fleeing what you have been, but choosing what you will protect. Her career is a map of restless intelligence. She moves between studio spectacles and small, bruised indies with a curious refusal to be boxed. One moment she inhabits the glossy world of fashion and power with a razor-sharp comedic code. The next she is buried in the ruin of a character whose life has been bent by circumstance. She is nimble, yes, but the art beneath the nimble is what holds. She is not a chameleon that changes colors for convenience. She is an artist who chooses roles that promise to ask of her something she has not yet given. There were missteps, films that missed their mark, choices that later felt like detours. But the narrative of an artist's life is rarely a clean line. It is a series of experiments, of turns taken in faith, of risks that pay off and risks that do not. What matters is not the perfect ledger of hits and misses, but the courage to keep choosing, to keep placing oneself in service of the work. Anne chose such courage again and again. And behind every polished premiere and every camera flash, there was another, quieter practice, that of guarding the private pieces of life against the hungry machinery of celebrity. She learned discretion not as a hiding, but as a defense of what mattered. She spoke when she had to and stayed silent, when silence was the truer answer. She used the platform she had to give voice to things that mattered, to causes that stretched beyond the lens. In public, she became a steward of empathy, a voice that could translate fame into attention for the unnoticed. If we look closely at her performances, we find a particular talent for tenderness. There is an insistence in her work on the dignity of smallness, on honoring the quiet human acts that compose a life. She can make a whispered apology feel like a confession. She can turn a simple smile into a map of a character's entire history. That capacity has made her beloved not simply because she is talented, but because she is honest. She treats even slight roles as if they are the hinge upon which a scene will turn. She brings a respect for craft that feels almost religious. And still, even the most devoted artist is not immune to the erosion that life sometimes brings. There are losses that arrive at the edges of fame, friends who pass too early, projects that fracture, relationships that teach the hard lessons of what remains when the cameras stop rolling. She has known the small deaths that live inside a long career, the aborted scripts, the roles that never quite landed, the compromises we accept, and the ones we later regret. Through it all, she has kept a certain humility, a refusal to inflate success into self. As she ages, as we all must, the lens adjusts. The parts she chooses now are often less about proving a range and more about consolidating a life of meaning. They ask for nuance, for restraint, for the quiet labor of being believable. She finds power in soft things, in parenthood, in a marriage rebuilt of patience and attention, in the quiet work of mentorship. She understands that legacy is not only a string of awards or a hall of roles, but also the small, stubborn lifelines you throw to the next generation of artists. She teaches without preaching. She listens without agenda. There is a generosity in her choices, too. She has lent her voice to causes, to children's hospitals, to education, to artists who lack platforms. She gives in ways that are not always loud. That discretion is part of what distinguishes her, an ethos that says influence is best spent on what repairs rather than what dazzles. She sees abundance not as a thing to store, but a thing to pass on. Her life, when we hold it up to the light, reads like a lesson about balance. She built a career from modest roots and sustained it with fierce discipline. She tasted the sweetness of fame and learned slowly the necessity of protecting the life behind the headlines. She fell in love publicly and learned to love privately. She won the highest honors and recognized their limit. She learned that the truest measure of success was not applause but presence, being there for the small moments that will not be recorded. And so, as the years gather and the world rewrites its memory of her, Anne Hathaway stands, not as an untouchable icon, but as a humane one. She is the woman who taught us that vulnerability can be a superpower, that seriousness need not be joyless, and that a life can be both luminous and ordinary. She has shown that a person can build an empire of art without abandoning the things that make art worth having: family, privacy, curiosity, and an unending willingness to work. There are images we hold on to when we think of her. The young girl taking her first big step in a princess dress, the actor delivering a line so true it makes a room hush, the woman on stage, raw and unadorned, letting melody become confession. These images are not the whole story, but they are the seams through which the story is stitched. Between them exists a life of choices, some celebrated, some quiet, all of them shaped by the same steady hand. If there is a single through line to her life, it is this: Anne did not seek to dominate a craft. She sought to inhabit it. She did not want to be admired from afar. She wanted to understand the human heart well enough to show it back to us, without gloss or pretense. In a culture that often values the loudest voice, she chose craft over clamor, honesty over spectacle. That choice has made all the difference. There are nights now when she closes a script and walks to the window, watching the city breathe. There are mornings when she wakes before dawn to make breakfast for a child, to answer an email from a colleague, to return to the quiet work of being present. Fame still follows, like tidewater. It rises and falls, but it does not define the shore where she stands. She has learned to let the public life be what it must, and to refuse to let it swallow the private one entirely. Her story, in the end, is not a fable of flawless ascent. It is a human story, wounds tended, mistakes owned, love pursued despite fear, art pursued despite the cost. It is the story of someone who learned that being great at something does not exempt you from being small in others, that being famous does not make you immune to grief, that success does not substitute for presence. And that is the gentlest miracle of all, that a woman who could have chosen to drink exclusively from the cup of acclaim instead chose to spend her life at the slower task of living, and in doing so made the work, and herself, into something with depth. If her journey moves you, it is because it is true to a certain stubborn, ordinary courage. The courage to keep trying, to keep learning, and to keep choosing the small, honest life even when the world offers everything louder. to work with devotion, to love without perfection, to teach without pretense. Anne Hathaway's story is not finished. No life is. But when we look at what she has built so far, the roles that bear her fingerprints, the quiet generosity she has practiced, the small domestic revolutions she has chosen to protect, we see a life shaped by a rare economy, the economy of attention. She has paid attention to the work. She has paid attention to the people she loves. She has refused to trade either for the brief wind of celebrity. And in that refusal, she has taught us something we would do well to remember, that the bravest thing a person can do is to be fully present for the life they have been given, to give their craft a body and their relationships a sanctuary, to keep it simple and keep it honest. There will be more films, more decisions, perhaps more awards. There will be disappointments and late-night revisions and the small regrets that live quietly alongside awe. But there will also be dinners in a home grown warm by laughter and hands that reach for one another in the dark, and the stubborn hum of vocation that keeps calling her back to the script, the rehearsal, the scene. That hum is the truest legacy. It is the sound that remains after applause fades. It is the echo of a life that chose, day after day, to serve a craft and to protect a private self. It is the voice that says, softly but unyieldingly, keep going. From a house where stories were ordinary things to stages and screens that have made whole rooms hush, Anne Hathaway has walked a path marked by care. She has made fame into something bearable. She has made art into something generous. She has reminded us again and again that the measure of a life is not how loudly the world shouts your name, but how faithfully you answer what you were made to do. If this story moved you, if her patient courage warmed you even for a moment, then pass it on. Tell someone about the actress who learned to make vulnerability look like strength. Tell someone about the woman who learned to balance fame with presence, who understood that legacy is built in the small rooms we keep for ourselves. And as for Anne, she will keep working, she will keep choosing, she will keep listening, she will keep showing us, through 100 small, brave decisions, what it means to be an artist and what it means to be human. That is her gift. That is her life. That is her quiet kind of glory.